right, Senator Charlie Scott, good afternoon.
Well, it's good to be here.
Yeah, so just for our audience, I'll just set this up and say that this is Rob Monger, and I'm here at the Wyoming State Capitol. Today is March 10th, 2022, and I'm joined by Senator Charlie Scott. Senator Scott, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, pleasure to do this. And I want to talk a little bit about how I got to Wyoming and a few of my experiences growing up, because I'm the son of a medical doctor.
Yeah, that is so great.
I thought that might be of interest to you guys from the medical society.
Oh, 100%. I think no question. And for our audience, I'll say we may need to pause this. The legislature is currently on a break, but they might have to go back to vote, so we might need to pause.
We're at the end of the session. We will need to go back and vote, and it's unpredictable when.
Right, so we may need to pause, and that's no problem. We'll pause and pick it up as we do as we're going along. So.
I'll start by saying that I grew up here in Wyoming because my father was Dr. Oliver K. Scott, MD, was labeled by the U.S. Navy as a specialist in tropical medicine. And that's why I wound up in Wyoming. And what happened was, when he was in medical school and probably in college too, he was always interested in outdoor things and nature. And one of the things he learned quite a bit about was mosquitoes. And that's what caused, he graduated from medical school in 1941. And everybody could see World War II was coming. Yeah. And he would have been, knew he was going to have to serve. So what he and a bunch of other people did was volunteer for the reserves. And he graduated from college in 1937, went to medical school, and he was in the Naval Reserve when Pearl Harbor happened. And the Navy decided they'd much rather have a trained doctor than an untrained doctor. And so they deferred not only until he graduated from medical school, but deferred a year until he'd done an internship, the old traditional internship, which he was a graduate of Harvard Medical School. And his internship was at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston. And amongst other things, he told me he used the first dose of penicillin ever used in that hospital.
Wow, that's amazing.
And he said it was for a condition. He didn't tell me what the condition was, but a disease that he said he'd never use it for these days. But all the bugs were naive to penicillin then, and it worked like a charm.
Well, yeah, it's funny to think about now. We're also used to antibiotics, but in your dad's time, they were brand new.
They were brand new. The sulfa drugs had come along just before he went to medical school. And penicillin, well, as I said, he used the first dose ever used in the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital.
Yeah.
But he was in the Navy, and the Navy took him in just after he completed his internship year. And during that time, he met my mother, and they got married July 4th of 1942, and he went on active duty in the Navy right after that, and was stationed a number of places in the U.S. But the Navy had labeled him, because of his knowledge of mosquitoes, which of course is a prime vector in many tropical diseases. They labeled him as a specialist in that. He told otherwise he probably would have wound up as a medical officer in some warship.
Right.
But what happened was, they were bringing Marines back from the South Pacific, full of malaria and filariasis and all those diseases you get down there. And part of the cure is remove the sufferer from the tropics. So he was sent to a Marine base in Klamath Falls, Oregon, to treat these Marines that were coming back with all these diseases from the South Pacific. And since it was stateside, my mother could accompany him. And he'd been in San Diego as a house officer in one of the naval hospitals there. but he was sent up there, and Klamath Falls is central Oregon. Eastern Oregon is a landscape that is very similar to Wyoming. And he and my mother did manage to get over there a bit and really liked that. So I was born at the base dispensary in at the Marine base in Klamath Falls, Oregon. And my mother told me that was by no stretch of the imagination a hospital. But I survived just fine. But one of the things I have never been, and I'm 76 now, I have never been admitted to a hospital as an inpatient.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing, right? I mean,
that's good genes and a good dose of good luck and a little care.
So then how do they make their way to Wyoming then after that?
After that, what happened was the Navy sent him overseas for a year because he hadn't been during the war. And he ran a malarial survey team in Greece for a year, 1946. And he said he saw very little malaria. It had been just a major endemic problem in that area. He said the reason you drove into a new village and the British Army had painted DDT on the wall of the first house you came to.
Wow.
And they had gone through and just wiped the mosquitoes out with that pesticide.
Wow.
And with it, of course, went malaria. And they finally found some in one of the smaller islands that the Army hadn't gotten to. It was the British Army.
I mean, that's so interesting. I don't think of malaria as being in Greece, but maybe it was back then.
It was. Malaria, when you look at it historically, it was over a good part of Europe. Greece, Italy, Spain, well up into the center parts of the country. In this country, malaria came as far north as New York State. It was a major cause of trouble in the building of the Erie Canal.
Oh, I did not know that.
Because they were building it through swampy areas, the way you would.
I mean, I don't think of malaria as being in areas where it snows, right?
It was an endemic disease everywhere south of Mason-Dixon line, of course. But clear up into New York State, historically.
That's really interesting.
You read a history of the early history of the Erie Canal. They had a lot of problems with malaria.
That is very interesting. So he's in Greece for a year and then
he came back and went to Case Western Reserve. Decided he had, I think, offers from the Rockefeller Foundation to do tropical work in Africa and other places like that. And decided that wasn't what he wanted to do. It wasn't a good place to bring up a family. And so when he came back, he decided he wanted to become a pediatrician. And he did a residency at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio. So they lived there for 2 years. And then they went looking for some place to go into practice where the landscape was similar to that of Eastern Oregon.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
And Wyoming qualifies, and Casper didn't have a pediatrician and was growing like mad with an oil boom. And so he went to Casper. He was brought in by a partnership with family doctors. They didn't call them that, general practitioners.
Right, GP, the old GPs. Yeah. And so about what year was this? Maybe
this was 1948.
So?
Internship was over, and he came to Casper, bought a house, and then he and my mother, they each had a car, and they trailed. It wasn't a U-Haul in those days, but a trailer with a tarp on it with what household goods they'd accumulated.
So, I mean, for you've been living in Casper since 1948 then?
Yeah, so I came in 48, and my first memories were of the Great Blizzard of 49.
And you would have been about how old at this point?
At that point, I would have been 4.5. But what happened to him was he joined this group of GPs and found that their medicine was not up to date. You know, the antibiotic revolution came in really while he was in medical school and getting his medical training.
Yeah.
And it changed the practice of medicine just immensely. They started having effective drugs where they hadn't
Yes.
before.
Yes.
And he found that he could not in good conscience practice with that group. And here he was, first time he'd ever had a real job outside of the U.S. military.
Uh-huh.
Young family, because I'd had at least, my brother Stacy was born in Cleveland. And he quit them within a few months of coming to Casper. And he and Dr. Gordon Knapp founded the Casper Clinic, a pediatrician and a surgeon, which is not necessarily, he would found the Casper Clinic. And it was really a loose association of doctors in private practice that what they did in common was rent a building.
Yeah,
And
shared overhead.
shared
Yeah.
some of the overhead expenses, you
Uh-huh.
know, the receptionist. and
Well,
whatnot.
I would guess back then, Casper was much more isolated, and of course we didn't have the internet, it's harder to travel, and people
Yeah,
probably got...
it was a good deal. It was a good deal more isolated, and it was growing like mad with an oil boom that was bringing in a lot of very well educated people who were the geologists and geophysicists and whatnot that worked that,
Mhm.
and they expected good medical care,
You bet.
and they knew how to look up who was the specialist in town. Well, there was one pediatrician, and he was Oliver Scott, so his practice just exploded. And so I grew up, my very early years of my earliest memories, he was the only pediatrician in town. And so he was on call 24/7, 365 days a year. And I remember he had to make special arrangements to go back and take his board examination so he'd become board certified pediatrician.
Mm-hmm.
And then 53, 54, somewhere in then, he recruited Dr. Fowler, Robert Fowler,
Right.
as a second pediatrician. And they were partners for a number of years. And then my dad got to doing too many other things, so they had a very amicable splitting of the partnership because Dr. Fowler wanted to work harder at medicine, and my dad had some other interests. They were still both practicing tremendous time, but
Well, I mean, growing up, did you ever leave town to go on vacation? I mean, your dad probably couldn't take off.
he couldn't take off in those early years. He just couldn't. And that was, so getting a partner was that meant he could take off.
Right.
And when he was growing up, his dad was a bond broker in Boston, and then ran a lumber company up in Quebec. But it had bought a small farm, about 30 acres, and 6-7 milk cows in a suburb called Framingham. And my dad, I've got one of my dad's early diaries from when he was, I don't know, 10 or 12 or something. He kept a diary for a little while. And he clearly thoroughly enjoyed going out to that farm. And so he wanted to do the same. So he went in partnership with his nurse's husband, and they bought 160 acres in Bessemer Bend, west of Casper. About a third of it was irrigated. And my mother was a horse enthusiast, so she had a horse and a half horse, half pony, and a pony for us kids, us 4 boys. And we spent a lot of time going out there, summertime and weekends and whatnot, learning how to ride.
Yeah, you bet.
I've got some videos, the home movies of us kids riding, and they are somewhat hilarious.
Is that property still in your family now?
No, what happened was in 1956, a place that was in that same area, but just outside Bessemer Bend, about a mile away from this place, came on the market, about 5,000 acres. And my dad bought it.
Wow.
And so I grew up with that. And I started, the first time I did real flood irrigating was at the age of 11 on that ranch. And he proved to be very shrewd at real estate dealings. And he built that from about a 5,000 acre start to first about 15,000 acres, and then up to eventually it got, before he died, it became about 20,000 acres.
I mean, that's a lot of land. That's a big space.
And a lot of folks in town made some fun of him. He paid $9 an acre for that, some of that stuff, and they said it wasn't worth that. He knew what he was doing at that. He was very good at that. And he enjoyed getting out and being physically active. And if he had the weekend off, he'd often go out to the ranch and work. And I've got some of the home videos of picking up hay bales, and there he is.
Wow.
And he did enjoy it. He did a lot of fence building. He wasn't very good at it, but he did a lot of it. He never learned how to ride a horse, but he would walk all over that thing on foot, and he would take cars where no car should ever go.
Well, and
it was fascinating to kids because we got to do things with him. But growing up as a doctor's kid, I can remember in those days, us boys, we naturally enjoyed going swimming. The indoor pool in town, the only one, was Natrona County High School. And they had a public swimming one evening every night during school year, once a week during school year. And he would take us, but about one night in 3 or one night in 4, he'd have some kind of medical emergency at the hospital and couldn't do it. And that was our exposure. Yeah, it really came back to the extent that the doctor had to be a dedicated professional, had to be on call, and that would take priority. And that was just the way it was.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of people didn't on the phone those days, naturally. And so we were not allowed to answer the telephone or talk on the telephone. That was reserved for medical uses.
That's a fun story.
And we lived in town relatively close to the hospital, so we could get there in a hurry. They did not have hospitalists. They did not have, they had trained nurses on staff, and that was it. There was a medical emergency. If he was on call, he went right then. And I can remember a number of times he'd leave from the dinner table because he got a call to go to the hospital right then.
Well, he probably missed a lot of Sunday dinners and holidays and
that sort of stuff. And but once he had Dr. Fowler there, then he could take off and he'd take Thursday afternoon off and go out and do something in the range. And us boys would go along, and we'd work summers out there. And it was a very good experience growing up. I do remember there was a diphtheria outbreak in Casper. Late 50s, 57, 58, somewhere in there. I was in junior high at the time. And that it came on top of a flu epidemic. And there were 6 cases in kids hadn't been vaccinated. And the doctors that treated the first cases didn't recognize it. They'd never seen diphtheria before. He had, having done an internship and a residency in big urban areas, he'd seen a case or 2 before. So he made the diagnosis. But 6 kids got it, and 3 of them died. And every parent in town wanted to get their kid vaccinated yesterday.
Yeah, you bet.
And the phone just rang off the hook, and he had a flu epidemic he had to deal with at the same time. And it was just a madhouse. But we went from the standard vaccination to you want my kid vaccinated right now. And that was an eye-opening experience. You know, I'm a junior high kid. I started to recognize things.
Yeah.
And that memory has always stuck with me of what an outbreak of a really deadly disease was right. And, you know, this wasn't, you know, diphtheria is not like this COVID thing. It's flat out much more dangerous. What the COVID rate at the peak was 2 or 3% of the people that got it, maybe,
Right.
when they didn't know how to treat it at all. Get that diphtheria outbreak, that was 50% of the kids. And the vaccine was very effective.
That's something.
But that was an eye-opening experience, and one that has guided a lot of my thinking on public health issues.
It's really interesting. So then, which high school did you go to, and where'd you go to college, and how'd you wind up
Well,
coming back to Wyoming?
what happened was I went through the public schools in Casper, Grant School and Dean Morgan Junior High. The 8th grade at Dean Morgan Junior High, when I was there, had virtually no academic content. There was a math course that was a review of math starting with 2 + 2 = 4 and not getting too much beyond that. It was a disgrace. None of us in that class learned anything. There was a typing class that was proved to be very useful, a very useful skill to pick up for future academic things. That was good. And there was a English course where the instructor taught us how to write a literate paragraph, and that was very useful. And I had Jack Seedy for American history, and he was a very good teacher, very interesting. And the only problem was I probably knew more about American history than he did. because my dad I had not been doing very well in reading in the early grades. Sort of in the middle level, they divide the classroom up into 3 sections, and one would be the bright kids, and one would be the middle kids, and one would be the dumb kids. And I was in the middle kid group and not doing very well. And my dad took to reading to me things that he was interested in, history stuff. He read Ward's War, the American Revolution to me. He read a volume or 2 of Samuel Eliot Morrison's Naval History of World War II, which he'd always been interested in ocean things and sea things, and a pretty good sailor himself, and he's probably coming to Wyoming. And I got interested, and then I took off reading those things on my own, so I didn't have to wait till when he was available. And that made all the difference in the world.
And that's something, yeah.
And I had read a lot of history, and so I knew a lot. But that was it. There was no science. As I said, the mathematics was a joke, and it's just a waste of time. And he was horrified. He's a real believer in education, and so was my mother. And I got sent away to school after that. I went to a place called Phillips Exeter Academy.
And where's that? That's on the East Coast somewhere?
Exeter, New Hampshire. It's on the Great Bay of New Hampshire. And there were some family connections there. My mother's family, that had been their general location. It's actually where my grandparents are buried. And some of her early ancestors had been pirates that operated out of Exeter, out of the Great Bay of New Hampshire. Started out as legal privateers in Queen Anne's War and found it profitable and just kept right on going when the war was over. And if the French would ever caught them, they'd hung them. But they didn't. And
So you were 14 or 15 and they sent you off to school?
yeah, for 9th grade, so all 4 years of high school. And I did not like it, and I did not approve of it, but I didn't have any choice. The old man said go, and that was it.
And how did you, when you got out there, were you behind the other kids?
A little, yeah. a little. And I had a rough sophomore year. Combination of homesickness and some challenging courses and some tough professors. I came home one term with a whole bunch of D's on my report card. And my dad handled that very well. But there was a clear expectation I was going to do better.
Yeah.
And I learned how to study and gradually did better. But that place expected an hour of preparation for every hour of class. And I had a Latin instructor who expected 2 hours of preparation for every class. It was a fascinating class because you knew somebody was going to catch hell and you knew it might be you. And you had to be perfect. And that was a very good experience for me. It taught me how to work and how to get the details right. And learned a lot about writing and get used to writing things. And so I got a good education, but I did not approve of the atmosphere. It was an all-boys school.
Well, far from home, and you probably felt isolated.
Yeah,
sure.
it was a good education. And a quarter of the class, including me, got into Harvard.
Wow.
And I did not enjoy my high school years. I thoroughly enjoyed my college years.
What was the difference, do you think?
Growing up a bit and a little more freedom, and the academic quality was there. And that was the time, that was mid-60s. And at that time, Harvard would have been arguably the best college in the world. And I got exposed. I took a biology course. They had 2 biology courses. One of them was taught by a fellow named George Wald, who earned the Nobel Prize for his work on colorblindness, who got labeled, after I was there, got labeled by Time as one of the 10 best college teachers in the country, and deserved it. He was very good, and I learned a tremendous amount, got an enthusiasm, groundings in the fundamentals of science and enthusiasm for it, but I was never any good at lab stuff. There was a young lady, Cliffies, we called them because they went to Radcliffe, and they were about a quarter of the class then at that point. And I had one who was a lab partner who was very good at knowing how to follow a recipe, so she could make the lab do what it was supposed to. And I could understand what it was supposed to, and we made a good team.
So did Harvard admit women back then, or was it all?
Well, they had started, the women had started much earlier a companion, a sister school to it, that tried to be the same thing for the women that Harvard was for the men. And during the Second World War, they merged the classes. So they were essentially attending Harvard, but they were theoretically Radcliffe.
I see.
And their admission standards were different. They were much stronger on grades and academics than the men's college. And one of the things Wald did in the biology class was we took an exam midterms or at the end of the term. He would break the scores down on the thing. The pre-med, men and women, Radcliffe and Harvard, and non-pre-med, Radcliffe and Harvard. And the top of the class was the Radcliffe pre-med. Way head and shoulders ahead of everybody else. And the Radcliffe women came next. There was a certain amount of rivalry. Effective motivation. But it was just an absolutely fascinating class. There was a prof that gave about a quarter of the class. Name was Johns Hopkins. Just spelled that way. Same family as the university.
So did you
and
think,
a very good lecturer.
Did you think about going into medicine?
I never wanted to. I did not think I would be good at the actual physical end of it, some of the doing the minor procedures and whatnot. I'm all thumbs when it comes to a bunch of that sort of stuff. I guess my dad had some of the same problems because I remember hearing tales of him. He learned how to knit, trying to learn enough about suturing and something so he could do that, and that was considered to be good training for that. And he would knit squares of things just to try to get the manual dexterity required for that. And I just didn't have that kind of thing. So the intellectual part of medicine, the thinking out of how do you take the evidence and put the diagnosis together, I think I could have done that just fine. But I wasn't at all sure I could do a lot of the other things that a doctor has to do.
So what did you wind up majoring in, and what did you go into?
I was very much interested in politics, and both my parents were. My dad had been state chairman for Citizens for Eisenhower, and my first experience going door to door in a political campaign was 1952. There was a precinct in Casper between the Burlington tracks and the Northwestern tracks that was pretty rough. And they didn't have a Republican precinct committee man. So my dad recruited a bunch of us kids, and I would have been 7 at that point, to just stuff doors with the Republican brochure. And I thought of it as Eisenhower literature because Eisenhower's portrait was on it, because he was leading the ticket naturally.
So you grew up around medicine, but you grew up around politics also.
And my mother was active in the League of Women Voters, and then was active in the Natrona County Republican Party, was they had a vice chairwoman of the county party in those days, and she was that for a while, and I think she may have been state committee woman for a term.
Wow.
So she was active in that, my dad was active in that, and in 1959 he was part of a group of young men that decided the city of Casper was very poorly run, and got it transformed into a council manager form of government, the city manager, instead of American council form. And he served 3 years in the Casper City Council.
Your dad did,
And I remember going door to door for him, and that campaign stuffing doors with literature.
Oh, that's great.
And that was, they ran him on off years, and so it was 1959. And they elected a pro manager and council, and promptly went to the city manager form of government. And he had a technique for council meetings that only a doctor could pull off. He had a routine where he would check in with my mother about an hour into the meeting. And if the meeting was dull, it was, sorry boys, I gotta go. Gotta go to the hospital. Gotta go. If the meeting was interesting, it was tell the patient to take 2 aspirin and see me in the morning. Literally. Only a doctor could have pulled that one off.
So for you in college, if not medicine, it made perfect sense to be interested in politics. Right? 'Cause that was...
And I should have taken more of it in high school. I didn't. And I finally took an American history course senior year. But I knew that stuff. And we took this SAT exam. And I didn't take it in history because I hadn't had the formal instruction. I should have, because they took it as part of, they were doing an experiment and wanted to see. And I took it for that purpose. I think they were seeing if they had the grading right or something. And I got a 796 out of the possible 800 on it. Only having had a semester of formal American history since 8th grade. I should have taken more of that. But I took I had a fair amount of required science. I got a basics in chemistry and physics that had been very useful. And then got the biology in Harvard. And I had that guy who was very good. The other Harvard biology course, for the ones that had some biology in high school, so their introductory college biology course was a half year taught by Watson of Watson
Oh,
Creek.
no kidding. And it's impressive, right? I mean, it's just super
Yes,
impressive.
And when I was there, I took they call it government, basically, what we typically know as political science. Took enough science and math to meet the distribution requirements. Took first year calculus, did very well in it, took a look at what second year calculus was and said, I'd be smart to quit when I was ahead.
That's right.
So I never got beyond that. Took a statistics course with a fellow named Mosteller who was very good. And basic statistics I have used since then time and time again. I can read an article in a medical journal and understand the basic statistics they're talking about.
So what did you see yourself doing when you finished college? When you were in college, what did you think your future was going to be?
Well, I explored for a bit. For a while, I thought I was going to be a lawyer because I'd been fascinated by constitutional law. And I learned two things. I thought I was interested in constitutional law, but hunting through the details of contracts, I learned that that's what beginning lawyers do. And that very few of them practice any constitutional laws, which were really interesting. So I said, no, I don't think I want to do that. And then I thought about, I did reasonably well in academics, wrote a thesis on Wyoming politics when I was back there.
Wow.
And that was an interesting experience. And seeing the electoral pattern that was at that point the modern democratic became the modern democratic pattern, with the Union Pacific corridor being Democratic in Sheridan County, sort of. And that was foreshadowed by socialist votes in earlier years and the La Follette vote. But so the coalition was potentially there, but it wasn't until FDR that the Democrats took it over and became that. And the rest of the state being largely Republican.
Right.
But competitive. Natrona County was always competitive. And I was involved in any number of local campaigns.
But you were always Republican. You're
I was
Republican.
oh,
You
yeah,
were Republican.
Yeah.
So when you finished college, when you finished college, did you come right back to Wyoming then, or what happened?
Well, after college, I went to the business school. That was during the Vietnam War. And most of my classmates went to some kind of graduate school. Very few finished. College was not a terminal degree. And as I say, I thought about law school. I thought about becoming an academician, but there was a surplus of PhDs. And I was good at it, but I was not the top of the class. And the business school appealed to me then, partly by a process of elimination.
Was that an MBA or what?
MBA. I managed to get into the Harvard Business School, got admitted to the Stanford Business School, but got into the Harvard Business School, went there. And that was, and I was just a first-rate experience to me. All cases, they taught everything, including statistics on the case method. And it's a stretch to do statistics that way. But I learned a fair amount more about statistics there. They ran it with discussion sections of 100 students. And usually they wouldn't admit anybody straight out of college. But with the Vietnam War, they had to change that policy. So I got in straight out of college, about the youngest in the class. About 75–80% of the class had 2 or more years work experience. So those of us that were coming straight out were kind of junior.
Right.
And a lot of the guys were 10 years older or more. And they were just starting to get women coming through. And that I learned how to speak extemporaneously in public in that first year, because they give you a case of a business situation, and you'd have to be prepared. Hello? Can you check and make sure they're not going into session? They would give you a case a night. Okay. And you'd work it up overnight, and there'd be a study group. They encouraged students to join study groups. You're all doing the same case. And we'd have, I started in one that was 9 or 10 guys, and that broke up after about 6 weeks. And there was 4 of us that were kind of the nonconformists in the class. The only woman in the section, a guy that was a little far out. He drove around Harvard Square with a green parrot on his shoulder in a sports car. And myself and another guy. And we'd go over in the evening to where she lived in the Radcliffe graduate dormitory across the river, and spend a couple of hours going over the cases. We'd read them beforehand. We'd go over and, how does this work, and talk it out and be prepared. And we ran the rest of the year. Most of the other study groups broke up, but we found it such a congenial group, and all of us learned how to speak out in class and be articulate. And that, my dad was an awful public speaker. He just couldn't do it. He'd stare at his feet, he'd stammer, and it just didn't work. I learned how to speak comfortably, extemporaneously, and that is very valuable for me downstairs here in the Senate.
No kidding. Yeah, what a great
Because I can do that without thinking about it twice.
So these days, I think of people who go to Harvard Business School as people who want to go work for hedge funds on Wall Street and become multi-billionaires.
And
right?
going down to Wall Street and worshiping the golden calf didn't appeal to me at all. But I wanted to come back to Wyoming, and I thought maybe the way to do it was to do it in banking. And that would have been a viable route. I know at least one guy in Casper that did exactly that. Came back and ran Jonah Bank for a while. That would have worked. So I took some banking courses, but basically I'd had a pretty general education with a lot of emphasis on what they called control. How do you use accounting information to manage a large organization? And so I got quite a dose of that. And I was debating my second year, the big activities, the back half of the second year is finding the first job.
Right.
And I interviewed with a number of banks, and I interviewed with the Department of Defense Systems Analysis. And I had a job offer from DOD, the McNamara's WizKids Systems Analysis. And I had a job offer from the Industrial National Bank of Rhode Island, which was the big bank in Rhode Island, and since merged, long since gone. And the job offer was, in terms of the work, it was ideal. You'd go do studies on management problems all over the bank. You'd learn the banking business in a hurry. But I wanted to get the hell out of New England. I was single. I had enjoyed, I didn't start dating till college, really, because I haven't gone to an all-boys school. There wasn't the opportunity.
Right.
And I was interested in, having a normal social life and whatnot, and I wanted to get out of New England.
Right.
And so I was debating which one of these two was I going to take. And a fellow named Fred Malik came along about April, right at the very end of the recruiting season, looking for MBAs to be a staff, essentially an operations research staff for him, running the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He was going to be the deputy undersecretary, and the usual pattern there was the secretary was the outside guy, dealt with the press, dealt with the Congress, dealt with the interest groups. But in HEW, both the secretary, who was Finch, and the undersecretary, who was a fellow named Veneman, were going to do that sort of thing. And they hired Malik to run it internally. And I had the credentials, I had the MBA degree. I was what they called a Baker Scholar, meaning I was top 5% of the class there. And I got an offer. I said, it's much better than Pentagon. And it gets me out of New England, and I took it.
So was that in D.C., Washington, D.C.?
Washington, D.C. So I was a career GS-11 bureaucrat and spent 2 years at HEW, and then went with EPA 3 months after it was formed. A bunch of our group went over there, and Malik went to the White House. And I had one tasking from him. They were having troubles with the IRS. It wasn't cooperating with them. And the story we got was they were trying to do some organized crime things, and the IRS wasn't cooperating. They wanted to find out how it ran internally. So I got sent over there theoretically to look at how HEW was trying to decentralize. And how did the IRS do it? Because they'd done it successfully. So I spent 3 weeks interviewing people all over the IRS to figure out how it worked. And I did a good report for HEW, and this is how they're making their decentralization work, because they had 2 numerical metrics that they were measuring all the subordinate offices on. And that's the problem in a government setting. You don't have the good numbers that you in the private sector with the profit measures and the measures related to profit. They were looking at number of cases closed and amount of extra money brought in. And they wanted both, because they wanted to put the fear of the IRS into as much of the population as they could, but they didn't want their agents pursuing one where there wasn't much take. So they wanted them to learn to quickly spot, was this one we better take a hard look at, or
right, kind of big fish,
get it done
fish.
quick and close it.
Yeah, sure.
And go on to where the money is.
Right.
And that was a pretty good way, and they were managing it quite well then. And I also looked at who did what.
Excuse me, sir, they might be getting close, but they haven't gaveled in yet, so.
Okay.
Yeah, just let us know. Yeah, we'll take a break whenever you need to.
We'll take a break, and I'll be right down. But that wasn't what Mr. Haldeman, what I wrote in my report to the White House was, for God's sake, don't mess with the IRS. You're going to get yourself in political trouble. That's one of the things that did Truman in. It was. He messed with the IRS predecessor, and there was a scandal over it. And Nixon would have had the same. But I was not offered a job at the White House, which I think I would have been, because Malik had taken a fair amount. He took the guy I shared an office with over there, and that guy wound up on the front cover of Time because Malik was running the half of the committee for the re-election of the president that didn't get involved in Watergate, but some of the subordinates had helped with some of the things. And my friend helped shred some documents just to be helpful. And he got himself on the front page Time as one that was going to get indicted, and he had to hire a lawyer, and he didn't get indicted. But I managed to avoid all of that by having the nerve to tell them something they didn't want to hear.
So then were you able to take some of those?
So then I went to EPA instead.
Were you able to take some of those lessons from IRS back to HEW? I mean,
Yeah, on the decentralization thing, that was all on the up and up. I did that in court, and whether they ever did anything with it, I went to EPA. And eventually ran the water budget officer for the water programs, then on Russell's House staff for a while. I better go down. I've got.
Yeah, you bet. We'll take a pause and. Okay, we're back with Senator Scott.
Yeah, I would say one thing in my experiences at HEW, I was the liaison between the Office of the Secretary and the National Institutes of Health for a while.
Oh, that must be
Used to go out there about every 2 weeks and talk to the director, and mostly about administrative things. And I don't remember some of the details, but I could get in to see him right away. And so all the secretaries there figured that I must be some kind of a doctor to be able to do that. So I'd always get introduced to Dr. Scott, and I gave up on directing him on that. Anybody that could see the director must be a doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
And interesting experience, we looked into the Bureau of Health Manpower, which was part of the NIH at that time. I don't know what they call it these days. But they were finding for people that had postdoctoral fellowships and whatnot, basically doing future medical researchers.
Sure.
In the transition between their academic education and when they actually became full-fledged researchers. And they all had to do annual reports on what they were doing. And the Bureau of Health Manpower had extra wide hallways in their office building. And they were piled floor to ceiling with boxes of those reports, unopened and unread. Just a total, and a lot of effort. We looked into something. A lot of effort went into those. Kids thought that was important. They weren't kids;
Right.
they were young adults,
Right.
late 20s, early 30s, and they thought they were important. And there was nobody to read them, and those things were absolutely of no value. But they insisted on them, and they were just being stacked floor to ceiling. Nobody was looking at them.
So the classic government bureaucracy, right?
Yeah, that's made me skeptical of government reports ever since. And one of our taskings was, I was the lead on it, and we had a young lady from another group that was participating and helping me. The assistant secretary for that covered medical education at HEW was a fellow named Dr. Egeberg, who'd been the dean of a medical school. And he had told the Congress that we were facing a 50,000 doctor shortage. And so I and this young lady were assigned to go find out what really was going on there. What was this shortage? First thing we found out was he had no basis for it at all. He just made that up right off the top of his head. And not that uncommon in the federal government. I remember talking to one of the bureaucrats I worked with quite a bit. He said, well, one time his boss went and Congress asked him for a specific number of how much of something or other they were doing, how many dollars. And the guy gave him a number that proved to be the guy's Social Security number. Just translated into appropriate thousands of dollars. And Ken said, well, gee, we had to then go back and justify it. And he was close enough so we could. So that was an education of how much to believe the government on
The
certain
federal
things.
government, right? Yeah, no kidding.
So anyhow, we were told to go out and look into this doctor shortage and see what it was.
Yeah.
And we found there was something real all right. They were getting radically short of primary care doctors. Now, internal medicine, pediatrics, family practice. But that wasn't what Dr. Egeberg had in mind at all. He wanted to expand medical schools. That's why he told them there was a shortage.
Right.
And he knew what a good medical school was. It was one that produced a lot of specialists, not these grubby primary care doctors. That was his prejudice. And that was what he was seeking to do. And we said, yeah, there is a shortage. And you can predict which medical school will produce what kind of doctor. You want to fund, well, there was a thing called Meharry that was a black medical school. They were producing lots of good primary care doctors. You want to fund that one. That ought to be your lead one. And a lot of the smaller states, some of the state schools and whatnot, you could predict the yield in primary care doctors by the medical school. You do a fairly good job at that point. And that wasn't what the powers that be wanted to hear.
Yeah.
So that report got just shelved and ignored. But that was my introduction to health manpower shortages. And that is carried over.
Yeah, right.
It's here.
And so you remember, it seems like these days, we talk about shortages a lot, but it seems like there's a lot of doctors in the cities and not nearly as many in rural areas.
Yeah.
Was it like it back then too? Is it always been that way?
Yeah, it's been that way for a long time. the bright light, and that's where the paying patients were.
Right, right.
And the suburbs, geographically, the suburbs were oversubscribed. The inner city didn't have enough, except they had the big medical centers because they were there because that's where they could get their patients that they needed for the doctors. So some of the inner city work, if you got something bad in the inner city, you're in pretty good shape. You could go to some of the best in the country, and yeah, you were used as a teaching subject, but the care was first class medically. And then the rural areas were short.
So you must have been on the East Coast and involved in this back with Lyndon Johnson was signing Medicare and Medicaid into existence.
Well, no, I came in Nixon. The Nixon administration was 6 months old when I started the feds. So I was there all during the Nixon administration. And I wound up at EPA, wound up on the joint staff that Ruckelshaus and a fellow named McQuarries, who was the deputy at EPA, had. And I was mostly working for Quarles, but I was in a number of meetings with fairly large scale, dozen people sitting around a table or more. Ruckelshaus figuring out the agency strategy and enunciating that, okay, one of the problems is we're putting regulations out and we're being ignored. What do we do about that? And it was go after the big boys on water pollution cases, air pollution cases, and nail their ass. And everybody else would think, you better watch out, these guys are dead serious. It worked, and Bill Ruckelshaus was the best bureaucrat I ever saw. He knew how to put the agency together, give it a good strategy, and some of that agency had been reorganized, 6 times in 5 years, sort of thing, and it had just totally destroyed its ability to do anything. So Ruckelshaus stabilized things, put things together. When I became budget officer for water programs, we had 2 guys in the office who were senior professionals. One of whom, they had him in the back room reading magazines because he couldn't do anything. He was a recovered alcoholic, I think. And the other one was just burned out. He was capable, but he wasn't doing anything. And I put the staff together a bit and got another guy or 2 in. And we started really actually doing things. And the guy that had been sitting reading magazines, it would have taken me a year out of my career to get rid of somebody in the federal government. You can't do it. So we put him to work updating charts in the Management Information Center we put together. Except when it was really important, the secretary did it rather than him. But we got at least some work out of him.
So then you only stayed at EP for a couple of years, and that's when you came back to Wyoming after that?
Yeah, I had an experience. I came back in the fall while I was in DC in 71, so the second year I was there. My dad came through in the fall, F70, and said, that ranch was the best investment I ever made. I think we'd buy another one. And he went deliberately looking for a rundown place we could restore. And he bought a thing called the 2 Bar out in Bates Hall, which is where I am now. And it was, we at that point, we were about 15,000 acres and 300 cows. That was 64,000 acres. It had 5,000 head of sheep on it that he sold before he owned. We didn't want anything to do with sheep. We didn't like them and we didn't understand them and we knew it. And there was about 500 cows, and the previous management they selected their replacement heifers by the ones that the buyers didn't want in the fall. I can't think of a worse way to select them. And so they had great big cows, itty bitty calves, and that's not a prescription for profitability. And the previous owners had a fellow named John Tobin was running it. And he started about 1905 or 06 or something. He and his wife did a desert land entry there in '08. So he started then, and he gradually took it over. He was a relative of one of the guys in the consortium that owned it at that point. And he ran it pretty vigorously and pretty well until he died in 1966. And these last years he must have turned things of necessity over these boys. But he didn't train them very well. And they feuded. And when we bought, we were told they hadn't spoken except through a lawyer in 20 years. You can't run a place that way. Everything was wrong with it. Starting was we discovered that essentially the bunkhouse sewer emptied into the well. Basic public health, my God. And my brother was available and he was running it, and he, the old man, didn't get along. And he was one that was given to enthusiasms and willing to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And they got an awful lot done between them, but they couldn't get along, and Stacy couldn't get things done. And he departed, so there was a vacuum and an interregnum. I went home in the fall of '73 to manage the cattle sale. Took a month off, went home to do that. And that was just, the Arab oil embargo started right about then. And I had done the project I was working on at EPA on the control system internally. So I was kind of at loose ends, and I managed to wangle a detail over to the White House, to the Federal Energy Agency, and spent my last months in DC doing that. I remember they put in a bunch of regulations to govern refiners, trying to get the output they thought they had to have during that oil embargo, where there were real shortages. And they couldn't hire, because of the ethics rules, they couldn't hire anybody that knew anything about refining. So what they did was they put an older guy and me in a room with a set of telephones as for the refiners to call to say, how do we implement this or that or the other part of the regulation, to answer questions. And we know we didn't know silicon over it. So our technique was we'd answer the call, and this technical guy at the refinery would call up and say, we got this problem, and we'd say, describe it, and we'd listen to all the technical details without understanding them a bit. And we'd say, well, okay, it sounds bad. What do you recommend doing? And he'd tell us. We'd say, do it. And that was how we kept those regulations from getting the country in trouble.
Well, at least you had the common sense to actually talk to people who were on the ground doing the work, right?
Yeah,
Find out what's going on.
Well, we were set up that way to answer their questions on the regulations. There were a few things we knew to tell them, but basically it was technical questions and all about turnaround. We didn't know signal about that. They couldn't hire anybody that did. And so we essentially played their recommendation back to them. Yeah, do that. That makes sense.
So you wound up back in Wyoming in '73 then? Is that what happened?
No, that was, I spent a month in Wyoming. And then I became deputy director of the gasoline rationing office.
Wow.
Working for a woman who was a little older, had a Stanford PhD, who was Canadian in the process of becoming an American. But she was working for the Office of Management and Budget. And we were charged with putting together a credible gasoline rationing program.
Wow.
And spent January and February and March of the Arab oil embargo, early '74, doing that.
Huh.
And that was an experience. We took an agency from nobody to 64 people, wrote a set of regulations. I wrote a fair amount of them myself. We had a hired consultant. One of the big gate accounting firms had a consultancy arm that we were using. And they did a lot of the groundwork. And it was interesting. Knew something about the World War II regulation. My grandfather had been one of the regulators locally for a while. And that worked because of the wartime pressure and because the country was much less dependent on oil and gas. And we said, this is going to be an absolute disaster. So what we did was we made the coupons fungible. you could buy and sell them legally. We knew we were going to have black market. Hell, make it legal and pass them out based on every licensed driver gets so much, and then figured that the market would take care of it. And just passing them out was going to be, the first time was going to be a nightmare. We were proposing to close the post office to other window business for a week to get these things passed out.
I mean, that seems crazy.
That's what the Postmaster General thought until he spent a couple of hours in a gasoline line, and DC had them bad and no different. Okay.
We'll take a little break. All right.
We actually put together a set of regulations in that gasoline rationing, and our thought was that whoever was going to have to implement them was going to wind up as a household cuss word. And our first recommendation was they appoint some senior political official to lead it. We didn't want to. And the sensible thing was just turn the price loose. But I think what they wanted was a set of regulations that people would view as credible, and we produced those. And to help them convince the Arabs that we could live with this thing and they weren't going to get anywhere.
Wow.
And they backed off.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I don't know whether we contributed to that or not, but it was an interesting experience. And then after that, I came back home. But that whetted my political appetite, which was, I'd always been interested.
So what year was it you wound up coming back to Wyoming then?
1974.
Mm-hmm.
Came back in May. Went back there briefly to wrap some things up, and by early June I was back here and running our ranch, which had an interregnum because my brother had left, and so my dad was managing it with a foreman, and the third pediatrician in Casper, Dr. Patrick, had a heart attack. So my dad and Fowler were two pediatricians doing the work of splitting up the work of the third one because he was out of action with a heart attack, and he was just overwhelmed. And medical school does not train you how to manage an organization, and many doctors, as you know, have problems with business operations.
Absolutely, yeah, no question.
And my dad didn't know how to do that, but he knew there was a problem. And we were in danger of going broke.
Wow.
The thing was so run down and we were over our heads. And I was able I ran the place by myself for a couple of years. And then one of my other younger brothers joined me, and we divided the labor, cattle, and which he did, and the farming operation, which I did. And that worked. And we gradually, the thing, I'm told some other ranchers who thought about bidding on it decided not to, thought there'd be $1 million it would take to fix that thing. And that's probably what we put it in, but we had about 15 years there where every decision we had to make had to be right if it was major, or we were going to go broke.
Well, having that business background must have really helped you stepping into that situation, right?
Yeah.
Where you got to understand the money in the banks and the loans and how the whole thing works.
It works. And I understood enough of the physical end of it. And we've always run it. We're our own foreman. We do a lot of the physical labor ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing flood irrigation. I know about that. I started at the age of 11. And I've put Wyoming water to beneficial use in every year since then, except I think one or two while I was back in DC or the time I was in business school didn't get home for a year.
And so what was it like coming back to Casper in the mid-1970s after having lived on the East Coast for a long time and gone to Harvard and DC and all this?
And I wanted to come back to Casper. I prefer, that's home, and I prefer Wyoming. I like the outdoors. I like, frankly, I've been blessed with a job, earning a living, working outside and doing physical labor. And I enjoy it. It's good for me. I enjoy the challenge of taking what nature gives us every year, and it's always different, and trying to make it work for our operation.
That is so great. And so you weren't tempted to go get a job at a bank or get a government job?
This was so much better than anything like that, and I continue to feel that way.
Yeah, good for you. No.
I have never regretted that decision to come home. And as I say, it was a struggle. There were times I did not take a paycheck from the business because we couldn't afford it.
Well, looking back now, you must think that the reason you've been so healthy all these years, part it's got to be working on the ranch.
Yeah, well, yeah, I do think that. And I developed diabetes in about 1990 or 91. So I'm 30 years into that now. And the fact that I do physical labor a good part of the year, now there were times I would slack off before then. Now I try not to. Keeping blood sugar under control, I need to do the equivalent of walking. If I don't walk at least a mile a day, I get in some trouble. I really need 2 miles a day or equivalent, which I get routinely at home, just the work I'm doing.
Yeah,
and I enjoy it. And this place is not good for me.
So then, when you came back to Wyoming, did you get involved in politics kind of right away? I mean, your family had been
Yeah,
involved. Did you get
I
right
was-
back into?
Yeah, I was, I was young, I was single. I volunteered in 1975 to come down here as a lobbyist for an outfit that was an offshoot of the Wyoming Outdoor Council, lobbying for environmental things. And I spent most of a session sitting right behind Jerry Geis on the Joint Appropriations Committee, and because I was assigned to watch the Joint Appropriations Committee. And we had an amazing track record as lobbyists. We got almost everything we wanted at that session.
Wow.
We were trying to deal with the impact of a runaway minerals boom on a state that was just not prepared for it. And Governor Herschler was providing excellent leadership on that, and the senior members of the legislature were providing excellent leadership, and they were working with the Democratic governor, and had some senior representatives from that made their living in oil and gas, Tom Strzok, Warren Morton, people like that. And they stepped up, and Alan Simpson was another one of them. They stepped up and they did an excellent job in giving us the basic environmental laws of the Industrial Siting Council, the Clean Air Act, I forget some of the other regulations. But the experience for me was just fascinating. And I said, it'd be a lot more fun to be a member with a vote. Up here in the lobby, in the balcony watching them.
So then what was did you run in 78? Is that when you ran for office, or did you run before that?
Well, I ran in 76 and ran 14th and in the race and then for the House in Trumbull County. Ran again in 78 and ran 8th with 10 elected, so I was elected.
Wow.
And I still remember that first 2 days of that first term in the legislature, and just an immense amount of awe and pride. This is how a free people governs itself, and I've gotten elected to participate. And I've never, I come down every year and still get that old feeling back. This is an awesome responsibility, and proud that the voters have entrusted me with it. Proud to participate, and a little in awe of the tradition I'm stepping into and what I'm trying to do. I don't ever want to lose that feeling.
And so have you been in the legislature continuously since 78?
Since then,
And
yes.
so are you the longest serving
I'm
active
the longest
legislator now?
serving ever.
Oh, wow.
The previous record was a guy named McKinnon from Carbon County in the 20s, 30s, 40s, who was in 34 years, and I'm in my 44th.
Oh, that's amazing.
I had no idea when I started out that way that's what I was going to do. And I am so happy that I I did make the mistake of running statewide once, and I didn't understand what that was going to take, and it was an expensive mistake. But I'm glad I didn't go back to DC. They can't do things back there. We can get something done, and it's much more satisfying. And it meshes well with the outdoor life of running the ranch. I talked to Tom Walters, who's my neighbor, and he's a rancher too. And we, he said, it adds another dimension to life as a rancher that it's just totally different and really enriches the life being able to be a member of this place.
That is awesome. So looking back now, what was the legislature like back then compared to now?
It was much more of a partisan operation, and there were enough Democrats that they had to be taken seriously. The Republicans had a narrow majority, relatively narrow, and we had to work with the Democrats, and that forced everybody to be responsible. There were times we could be partisan, and there were issues we could be partisan on. Med-Mal was one of them. But it was a cooperative venture, and the principles are, as they are to this day, that you can be opposed, you can be an ally of somebody 1 minute and opposed to them the next minute, but you're friends and colleagues all the time, and you don't take it personal. And being human, we violate that sometimes, but it works best when we take that, and that's how life itself should be lived. You can disagree without being disagreeable about it. And that vote we just took, I've never had seen that done before. And I voted against moving him from the committee just a few minutes ago, because I did not hear a coherent account of what he actually did that justified that. And I didn't see it, so I don't know.
So you've never seen a vote like that in 44 years?
No, I've never seen him had to discipline a member. But, so I don't know what he did, but it must have been pretty bad. And I stayed out of the debate because I didn't know.
Let me ask you about some healthcare things. So I grew up here in Cheyenne, and I went to the University of Utah back in the 90s, or early 90s, through the Wyoming contract before WWAMI.
Yeah.
What was the history of that? How did Wyoming wind up with Utah and Creighton?
I don't know how we got with them. I knew we had it because we weren't producing any doctors of our own, and we needed more doctors, and it was an attempt to get that. And they were reputable medical schools that cooperated with us. What happened was the University of Washington developed just a very good school and developed this WWAMI program where they were the medical school for Washington, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho. And Dr. Coombs, I believe it was, who was there. I think he was their leader. I think he was their dean, or the dean of that.
I think that's right. Yep.
He came marketing, and Dr. Cole was our neighbor out on our original ranch. He lived in a nice house at the bottom of Jackson Canyon, just below where some of our Eagle Ridge ranch is, our original ranch. And he and his wife were friends of ours. And he invited me to come meet with Dr. Coombs, who was here selling, that we ought to join WWAMI. And it sounded to me like such a great deal. Now, I was not a member when we had the big debate over medical school for Wyoming. That was the year before I was elected. And there was the funds to start a medical school in the university budget. And there were 15 senators here, 13 Republicans and 2 Democrats, that essentially swore a blood oath that they would not vote for that. And they defeated the whole University of Wyoming budget. They were separate bills then. There were 8 separate budget bills, and that's one of them that had the money in it. And they defeated that over that issue. But just 15 votes. If any one of them had wavered, we'd have had our own medical school.
And did they tell you why they were so opposed to it? What do you remember? What they?
I didn't talk to them about it, but my dad had very strong views. He said we simply did not have the clinical resources in Wyoming that would be necessary to do a good medical school. He didn't know about the finances, but he said we don't have the clinical resources. This would produce third-rate doctors, and that's a mistake.
Wow.
And he was fierce on the subject, and I think he was right. So I had a dose of that from home. He had very strong opinions on that. And it had to do, and you know, I told you about that diphtheria outbreak. Where he made the diagnosis because he had seen cases before. And big city teaching hospital, you see cases of weird things that you're not likely to see. But
Sure.
I knew there were a number of cases where he had made diagnoses that others had missed because he had seen the specific thing the patient actually had before. And he was, you know, one of the things a doctor has to do. You know, so many of the things you treat are relatively routine. But the point in going to a doctor is that you guys, if you got something weird, you guys will spot it and make that diagnosis. And you got to have a good diagnosis for the treatment works. Or maybe it can work on a random basis, or you get well in spite of it. But to solve a complicated problem, you need to do that, and the doctor needs to have seen some of those things so he knows what to look for.
Sure.
And it's a miracle the way you guys retain everything and know, wait a minute, we
something's
better
not quite
consider
right.
this, and there's something not quite right here, and we better consider this.
So when Dr. Coombs came along to sell you on WAMI, was there a lot of support for WAMI? Did people want to switch?
Yeah, there was, it made so much sense because they were trying to train primary care doctors. And remember, I'd had that early experience
Yes. Yes.
and that made a lot of sense. It's what we needed. The University of Washington, it's interesting. They are rated the top in the country, and I think are to this day, in family medicine and one of the other primary care specialties. I think it's internal medicine.
Yep.
They're rated 10th in the country in research. Harvard, where my dad went, is the other way around. It's first in the country, was at that time first in the country on research, may still be for all I know, and 10th on the internal medicine and primary care. So I said, that's a quality we just can't get on our own. They're doing the science part of the medical education at Laramie at the university will improve our abilities to teach science at the university as well as do just the medical school.
No question.
And there were deficiencies in our undergraduate education program such they had difficulty getting enough Wyoming candidates to fill the quota at first. And that caused the university to reform some of its undergraduate teaching. And the university has built up from, it was a third-grade school when I was of college age. It is not anymore. It's getting to be a very good school. We're ranking 252nd, I think, in the most recent, or 254th most recent Wall Street Journal rankings, which are well done. We've beaten out Colorado State. We're better than anything in Nebraska, South Dakota, Montana, or Idaho. The University of Wyoming is becoming a major school with real high quality and pretty economical for students to go to.
Yeah, you bet.
And it's been just a steady improvement over the years. Every president except that one that was crazy, that didn't last, has left the place better than the previous one.
What about the residencies? What about the family practice residencies?
That, I thought that was, Wyoming needs to do its share of medical education, is my point of view. And having the residencies, it does two things. it's a family practice residency is we do have the clinical resources to do that. You hope they saw during their medical school something more beyond that. But we do have the clinical resources for that. We would get a certain yield off it. It's not as good as the yield off WWAMI in terms of doctors coming to practice here.
Right.
But it's still pretty good. And residencies don't have as good a yield as the medical schools. We do better than the national average with WWAMI and a little less on the residencies. And having the experience of teaching residents and teaching WWAMI students, both of them do rotations around the state.
Yep.
And that is very good at keeping our doctors sharp. Because
Absolutely.
if you're going to teach, and you're going to teach an eager young person that's going to question, and why do we do this? That improves the doctor that's doing the teaching. It's got to.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, my experience was when I was at University of Utah, there were no clinical rotations in Wyoming at all. And now with WWAMI, we have several hundred physicians across the state who teach medical students, and it's good for them to teach.
Yeah, it is. I remember my dad, he was always concerned about keeping up with things. And he got some kind of an appointment where one of the medical schools down in Denver would give you I forget what the appointment was called, but he'd go down 5-6 times a year and do rounds down there and talk with the students and talk with the profs and see cases and it's what he did to keep sharp.
Yep.
And what the residency in WWAMI they should do more of that sort of thing here. But what they do is make a lot of our doctors stay up to date and get renewed by contact with sharp young people who ask questions.
Yeah, no question. I think that's completely true. I think that's totally true.
And so WWAMI's a good deal for us that way
Yep.
because of the rotations.
Yeah.
And the residency centers, same thing. And I participated in beating back several attempts by John Turner, who was anti-Casper, and wanted to get rid of the residencies. And thank goodness Casper and Cheyenne hung together and have always prevailed against those attacks.
What about the funding for the residencies, where they don't get money from the federal government like every other residency in the country? Are you
That
familiar
was
with
a
that and what
screw.
happens?
That was a screw up when they first started, and I wasn't involved in that. I don't know what happened, but we missed some deadlines because we thought, we got plenty of money. There was an oil boom going on when they were set in place, and we've never been able to retrieve that. So they've always been a problem. And there was a disgraceful incident a few years ago where they were using the community health center as a source of clinical patients and were providing the health care there. And it was good for the residency. It gave the doctors real patients to practice on with you know how a residency works.
Oh, sure.
And it was good for the community health center. And goddamn, there was an empire builder got to be head of the community health center, and there was an empire builder who was stiff-necked about things, got to be head of the university's health sciences, and he was not. I never thought of him being very reputable. He had testified against on the plaintiff's side in a number of malpractice cases. I didn't like him for that reason. And those two fought and got a bureaucratic divorce, and they should have both been fired. The one at the community health center did get fired eventually. He got them in trouble. But the president of the university should have fired the dean. He didn't have the guts to do it. A bunch of us said, look, this is getting out of hand. And that's hurt both institutions. Just disgraceful bureaucratic empire building and ego.
Tell us about tort reform, all the tort reform stuff.
Yeah. And now, mind you, I came to tort reform I have never been enthusiastic on the legal system.
Uh-huh.
And We've had tort reform problems in this state primarily because of our court system. We went to what's called the Missouri Plan back in the early 70s, where the way judges are appointed, used to be judges were elected, and they were pretty conservative in Wyoming. They put this in as a reform because there's problems with electing judges. But you have a system whereby there's a judicial nominating commission, 3 laymen appointed by the governor, 3 attorneys elected by the Bar Association, private association, lobbying group, electing the members that are picking the judges. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the tiebreaker. Well, you know who's going to dominate that. The plaintiff's bar dominates the Bar Association. Every now and then a prosecutor gets elected to that group, but it's mostly plaintiff's bar. They favor judges whose known prejudices favor the plaintiff's bar. And this is a small enough state so you know what the guy's prejudices are. And the governor is a figurehead. He's given 3 choices. He has to pick one of the 3, or the Supreme Court picks the candidate from the 3. He can't say these are all no good, give me somebody else. And that means a special interest group is dominating the appointments to our judiciary, and they have been prejudiced. That's if you really want to do tort reform in the state, getting a system where there's a check on who gets nominated, whether it's the governor can reject them and tell them try again, get somebody that's good, or the Senate can not confirm them. Either one would work. That would be the most important tort reform we could do, and we've not been unable to get it done. And people don't understand to which degree that it's biased our judiciary. And the people that favor the plaintiff's bar tend to be political liberals, and that's what's produced the Campbell decisions on education financing that I'm struggling with right now. But that's a key factor to understand. And they have done some absolutely irrational things locally. They had this doctrine of loss of chance that you could get sued for. That arose out of a case up in Johnson County, lady in a nursing home that was at risk for having a stroke. And I suppose almost anybody in a nursing home is. And she had a stroke and it was fatal. The nursing home got sued and the doctors got sued. The justices came along and said because the allegation was they hadn't given her the aspirin therapy, and that deprived her of the chance to survive the stroke. And the only trouble with that was the stroke she died of was hemorrhagic.
So
and
aspirin
would have made it worse, killed the patient faster. But they said, no, you can't dismiss the case because she's been denied this chance to get killed quicker, I guess. And they then settled because the trials are so expensive. They had a group of radiologists down here, you probably know about, fought a case and won, and it cost them $400,000. And economically they should have settled. The judicial system is a disgrace. And it's national. You have these problems all over. There was the Harvard Medical Practice Study that resulted in the high end of the Institute of Medicine's medical errors estimate. They did a follow-up to that with that panel of patients. They had 50-some cases where there was a malpractice lawsuit. And the study showed what happened there. None of those cases went to jury. They were all settled. And that's the typical pattern. You can't afford the judicial system. Going to court is so expensive and so risky that nobody in his right mind does it. They found that one produced a figure that of the cases in which there were awards, 40% of them had no medical error. 40%. It was cheaper to settle, or they had a doctor who would have not done well before a jury.
Right.
A little too arrogant or something like that. You know, we've all seen a few of
Oh
those.
yeah. Well, yeah, no question.
The part they didn't publish was there was about a third of the cases where there was a medical error, and a bunch of them settled with no award. It was too expensive for the plaintiffs to fight it out, so they just gave up. The defense succeeded in running the cost of running the case up so high that they had to give up. When you combine the error rate, it was 44%, I believe. And so 56% of the time they were right, there was at least a medical error. And 44% of the cases were clearly wrongly decided.
So just about a flip of a coin.
Yeah. The system is totally ineffective as a quality control and has an incredible error rate and serves really, when you look at where the money goes, 3/4 of it goes to the people that run the system. The plaintiffs at bar, the defense bar, and the actual expenses of the judiciary itself. You add it all up, and 1/4 goes to the patients. That's a broken system. And so tort reform is clearly needed. You need something like the New Zealand system, where it's like a workers' comp thing. If you are injured, we don't worry about fault. We do require proof that it was injury. Something was done that was an injury. And then we compensate it on the schedule. You cut the attorneys out of it. The money goes mostly to the people who were hurt.
Yes.
You don't worry about fault. The doctors will come in as the patient's advocate when something went wrong.
Yes.
It is a much better system. And my wife and I went to New Zealand on a tour, and I just got talking with our bus driver, and he'd been compensated, I think, for an automobile accident where they did it the same way. And he was a real enthusiast for the system, and that was the feeling I got down there. That's the kind of system you need, but the political power of the plaintiff's attorneys and the defense attorneys too. You're talking about their livelihood too. You can't get it done, and our system we've got is a disgrace.
Do you think there's any pathway to change the system for the better? I mean, realistically, in any of our lifetimes, is there a way to get to some kind of no fault?
You could do it. There's a bunch of things you could do that get you closer. I don't know we'd ever, and you see that New Zealand is copying the Scandinavian system, which works well too. They're very much the same sort of thing. That's where we need to go. We haven't been able to make a way to get there. And part of it is the lawyers. They lie the courts and they take care of their own. And they pay their political dues, and they're an effective lobbying group. And we had really bad problems here. The principal insurer used to be St. Paul, and they left the business entirely. Then we had New Mexico Physicians Mutual, and we were bankrupting them to the point the regulators in New Mexico said, you got to get out of Wyoming.
Yeah.
And then we had just doctors in Ohio. What was their name? Ohio Casualty? Something like that.
Yeah.
And they essentially were going broke, and we were one of the causes. And we got down to just the doctor's company for a while, I understand. And I think that after the 06 thing, we didn't get the job done. And medical society, you know, they were up against a set of people who lie for a living. And they were defeated in the election. But just the campaign wasn't effective. But it may have scared them enough so that the courts got more reasonable. But that one is a powder keg.
Do you think there's any appetite in the legislature to bring that back? I mean, caps on non-economic damages or anything? No, it's just dead.
It's dead and it's ineffective. It makes it harder for them to do it, but it doesn't really do any good. You need to reform the system more broadly than that. A review panel with teeth, with the ability to dismiss, that would work. A schedule of benefits would work.
Yep.
You can get that. But you might get a review panel with teeth, maybe. That would be the effort. And an attempt, if we had troubles with the judiciary again, to reform the judiciary so
That's really interesting.
you had an objective set of judges appointed rather than a bias.
That's really interesting.
That's what I think the real tort reform needed. But I did my part pushing the reforms and trying to convince people, but we were up against big money and people who knew how to lie in public effectively. They were trained for it.
All right, let me switch gears and ask you about Medicaid. So Medicaid expansion of Obamacare has been around since 2008, I think, so more than 10 years, pushing 15 years now. Why don't we have it in Wyoming? What's going to happen with Medicaid expansion?
Well, let me go back and talk about Medicaid in general first and our medical system. You look at the results of the American healthcare system against other countries. They're disgraceful. We're spending 18%, is it more now? I don't know. I kept
Yeah, it's almost 20%, I think, of
of
GDP.
GDP on healthcare. You measure results in terms of mortality and morbidity. We are the worst in the developed world in almost all the categories. You look at it broken down by gender and that sort of thing. We're the worst. We are spending, I don't think anybody else is spending more than about 12%.
Right.
So we're spending a third more and getting the worst results. The system isn't working. And the question is why? Some researchers at Dartmouth, Wennerberg and a guy named Fisher, got access, which an academic researcher can, to the Medicare database. And what they did was they divided the country into quintiles into hospital. First, they divided the country into hospital referral regions. And looking at the map for this part of the country, they got it pretty close to right. And they compared those regions for Medicare as a whole for certain selected conditions. Broken hip was one of them. I think heart disease was another. Looking at some of the big things, they found that there was a 60% difference between the utilization. This talk price, when you looked at the adjustments they made to price, they were talking utilization, not price.
Right.
They found a 60% difference between the most expensive quintile and the cheapest one. So by using quintiles, you minimize the effect of the outliers, the real outliers. So there's a big difference. And then they found that when you looked at mortality and morbidity, the best results were in the least expensive quintile, the one with the least utilization. And the worst results were in the quintile with the highest. That says that we are overtreating big time. And you don't have to define, if you look at it that way statistically, you don't have to define what the overtreatment is. That's the evidence that it's occurring. And remember, this is not a sample. This is the full Medicare database. So you don't have sampling error to worry about. You may have some recording errors to worry about, but you don't have sampling error. And what that's telling us is our excessive costs are being produced by unnecessary utilization. And we are not competing successfully with the socialist countries, which is a disgrace.
Yes.
Because the way you manage a socialist system, when you look at the cost structure in healthcare, 5% of your population is like 70% of the cost. The people that are really sick and need health care. 70% of the population is like 10% of your cost. If you're managing a government system where you're on a fixed budget, you give the 70% everything they need and some things that they don't want, but they would really be good for them, some of the preventive things. And they're happy. That wins any election I ever saw. You take the 5%, the 70% of your cost, and you ration the hell out of it. And that's how you keep your costs under control, and that's how they work.
Yep.
And that's beating us, which it shouldn't. And you say, well, okay, why is there the excessive utilization? Part of it is even the HMOs are largely on fee-for-service setup. And the providers have an incentive to provide more, financial incentive to provide more care.
Absolutely.
And whether you're a welfare mother or a doctor, incentives count. That's human nature. So that pushes for more utilization. Then you have we want to stay out of trouble with the malpractice system. And that pushes you to go the extra mile, even if you know that the test is not really needed. You do it.
Sure.
Because you don't want to be in front of a jury with a lawyer saying, why didn't you do this?
Right.
And the system where they run off standard of care then reinforces a lot of extra things because it's part of the standard of care. All those things lead to excessive utilization. Plus the patients in some cases expect more and come in thinking you can cure everything that's an inconvenience with a pill and don't recognize, and they can get away with bloody murder in the way they live. Look at the obesity.
Yeah, absolutely.
You go into the days when the malls were more active, go into the malls, go into the restaurants. The obesity rate is frightening.
Absolutely. And it's different than it used to be. It's different than it was 25 years ago. Very different.
It's gotten a good deal worse as we've knocked the smoking percent, and we've done better than much of the rest of the world in knocking smoking out. That was the worst thing you could do to yourself. The absolute worst. And we've even gotten rid of a lot of the secondary effects, which there is good evidence for.
Yep.
Particularly the study out of Scotland, where they put in a ban on smoking in pubs and bars and that sort of thing. At the same time, they were doing a study on emergency room use in the National Health Service. And they found when that ban went in, there was an almost instantaneous 15% drop in admissions to hospital for cardiac problems. The correlation was just striking. And so there's very good evidence now on the secondary effects of secondhand smoke.
Oh, yeah.
And so our getting rid of smoking the way we have, that puts us in better shape on public health grounds. Now, you have more auto accidents in this country, you have more gun accidents in this country. There's some things that partly relate to the size of the country and some of the culture things.
Absolutely.
But we're doing pretty well on some of those kind of basic public health things. and not so on the obesity, but that runs across a lot of societies too.
So what's the answer for overutilization? Is it some kind of universal health care with some kind of
Well, the
rules
best,
and
the
regulations?
best answer that we found has been the Kaiser staff model HMO and the way Mayo actually operates, where you get a culture of we don't do unnecessary stuff. We don't need to, we don't do it.
Mhm.
And that's what we were trying here with the Healthy Frontiers.
Right.
And
And that was your idea, I believe.
yeah, and it was based on the things we've been talking about. And we had a couple of problems with it. We tried it on a small sample. It's basically using a health savings account with a low-income population, with efforts to educate them on what that meant and what. And it was successful in knocking utilization back. But we were having to do it on small numbers because we couldn't, so we couldn't afford a single catastrophic case. So we had to limit that. And we could not get the far right, which was opposed to spending government money on it. And I couldn't get it done while Friedenthal, who was willing to support me on it, was still governor, because I think the final bill passed when he was still governor, because I had problems in the House. And the chairman over there was a guy named Jack Landon out of Sheridan County. And he signed on as a co-sponsor to the first bill and then killed it. And he was a very thoughtful guy, nice guy, quite thoughtful. But he was an awful committee chairman because he could not make up his mind. And if the chairman can't make up his mind in the committee, he can't get the committee to make up its mind. And he just didn't get his work done. So he failed at least once over there. And then he got convinced that it was a good thing. And he was so slow he didn't get it out. So it came on the floor on the last day of general file in the House, having passed the Senate. And you know, you get 30 or 40 bills, and everybody with a bill under you wants you to be quick and get out of the way. And I was working with Blue Cross and Wendy Curran, and they did a good lobbying job. We had 40 votes. We had plenty of votes to pass it. And that SOB, he talked for 30 minutes on its virtues. And then Wayne Harvey talked for 15. And between the two of them, they got everybody so mad that the votes fell away and we lost it. I could have lynched the guy. And then he didn't run for election because he was too deaf. But by the time I actually got it through, I lost the executive branch support, which was Friedenthal, that I needed to get it implemented properly. And so the trial worked, but I was up against the far right in the House, and Buchanan, who's not Secretary of State, and killed it by not allowing us to carry over the funding and continuing it long enough to get effective results.
So it never really got off the ground after the
Never
trial.
really got off the ground, and that we tried that and it failed. No, he screwed it up and didn't give it a decent chance that it was working. So that's been one of the big frustrations I've had. So your original question was Medicaid. Medicaid is a very poor program. It actively encourages, the way it's set up, excessive utilization of very expensive health care in the emergency room. It doesn't pay very well, which is a problem, but it increases the excessive utilization. That's one strike against it. And that's fundamental to the design of it. Second thing, it is the poor payment. It pays, what, 40% of, or was, I don't know what the current figure is, I'm out of it now, but a good deal less than private insurance pays. And so there's a cost shift from Medicaid to everything everything else. And the cost shift is high enough so that I don't know how it works out for an individual doctor, but for a hospital, there's a break-even point where going all Medicaid reduces your revenue, even though it picks up the patients who can't pay it all.
Right.
And the hospitals have not paid careful attention to their cost accounting. And it turns out we have a problem with that big time in Wyoming. I thought it was active Medicare discrimination. But when Sue Wilson and I actually pursued what was going on, what goes on is that medical care for most procedures in a hospital involves very high fixed costs. Because not only do you have complicated medical equipment that's dedicated, but you have specialized teams of employees to run that stuff. And if Fort Collins can run a higher volume as they can, being on the front range of a much larger population, they can make money off of Medicare at a rate that we can't. And Medicare does, we get better pay from Medicare than Fort Collins gets. But it's not enough to overcome the volume problems of high fixed cost, which thrives on higher volume. I don't think that's good for the care, but it's good for the economics. So we have trouble competing on that score. And so we have trouble standing an extra cost shift from Medicaid. Plus, the insurance department and Blue Cross got in cahoots. And the way Obamacare works, they base all their subsidies on the cost of the second lowest cost silver plan. Now, when you have plenty of plans, that makes a lot of sense. It works fine. When you only have one provider, as Wyoming had, and the insurance department is on board, you run the cost of that second lowest cost silver plan up, means you're running all the silver plan costs up. You can then offer gold and bronze plans at no premium. And most of our gold and bronze plans, particularly the bronze plans, have been without premium and without significant copays because of the way that feds have that set up for the lower income people. And so we get an extra good deal in Wyoming that is better than most other states on insurance through the exchanges. And so Medicaid would wipe that out in good part because they would automatically transfer anybody up to 138% of federal poverty from insured status under Obamacare to Medicaid. And that increases the cost shift problems for the hospitals big time. And I haven't seen a break even done on that, but it needs to be done because we would have quite an effect. Plus, and this is a hard one to evaluate, the people that are under 100% of poverty, under the current service, they have to be 100% more to get on Obamacare. Anybody earning, a single person earning the minimum wage, and when I figured it, anybody with up to 2 dependents could earn enough in a low-skilled minimum wage type job to get on Obamacare if they needed it, and they choose not to. And a lot of it, when we took a bunch of hearings around the state, we had special pleading. I remember a gal up in Fremont County. She was an occupational therapist. That's a good paying occupation. She was 60 and she wanted to retire, so she did. And she wanted Medicaid expansion so she could get free health care. Be damned if I wanted to pay, subsidize somebody's early retirement for that. We had a minister come talk to us up in Lowell, and the church couldn't quite afford to pay her enough. Well, that's the circumstance in my church. Result was my minister had a job. She worked at a child care center and was a minister part-time. That's how you solve that kind of problem. This gal would have had to work 3-4 hours a week to get there. No, she wouldn't.
Yeah.
So much of it is just convenience. So for all those reasons, I have been distinctly unsympathetic to Medicaid expansion. What I wanted to do was to take our experience with Healthy Frontiers and put in a system where we used a health savings account, where the program would fund that for the low-income people, get them extra benefits with the surplus, allow them to transfer it to healthcare when they came off of Medicaid, so there'd be more of an incentive,
Right.
ability to move off, start up the economic ladder. And that would have required quite a bit of waiver and fighting with CMS.
Right.
I think we could have pulled it off, but the health department, led by Tom Forsland, was locked into, we want to do just a conventional expand Medicaid with all its problems. That was bureaucratically easier for them. And frankly, the Wyoming Health Department is probably the least competent department in all of state government. They have some competitors now, but they were just really awful, and they may have had a lot of trouble implementing that the way they should have. But I could not get them to support it. I thought I had a gut deal with Governor Meade, and Forsland kept right on attacking me. So I said, screw it. They won't do it in a responsible way. I'm going to join the right and just oppose it.
Wow. Do you foresee a time when it's never going to pass in Wyoming? Do you think legislature next year in 2023, or who knows? I guess it's hard to predict. But do you see the tide turning and maybe they're going to pass Medicaid expansion here at some point?
Not as long as I'm here. And the Senate, the Senate killed it 24-6 this time.
So not anytime soon, doesn't sound like.
No,
Yeah.
no. And when it first came, we had enough votes in committee the second year when we got a mature plan. I thought, gee, it's a major decision, and it was general session. And I thought, well, and this was really the second serious attempt. We ought to take that. I arranged to have a do not pass bill, or heard it early, got it out of committee, do not pass, and heard it on the floor in committee of the whole, which we normally don't do. And it went down big time. And it's gone down ever since. Every device, everybody's tried. And, Cale keeps, he had that personal experience. He would not have been eligible himself for an expanded Medicaid. You earn too much with the state legislature. There's nothing else. But he's locked in on it. And you've had an emotional response, and the proponents have always talk about how many people are going to get coverage. But they're deliberately deceiving the public, because they do not mention the percentage of those people that already have health insurance, through the exchanges. It used to be just through the private employer. It was about 26%. It's a good deal higher than that now. I haven't seen reliable figures as to how much it is, but it's a good deal higher because of the good deal we've gotten. So the proponents lie, and that's known.
Wow.
It's probably not a lie. They're telling you how many people are going Medicaid, which has been notoriously underestimated elsewhere. But it includes a bunch of people that already have perfectly good health insurance. So it's going to be a long time before Wyoming will do it, if we ever do.
That's really interesting. All right, let me change topics on you again and ask you about COVID. So this is now March of 22. COVID's been around for a little over 2 years. A lot of us are hoping we're getting towards the tail end of it, but I mean, who knows, I guess, right? Tell us about COVID in Wyoming and the state's response and all the things that have happened.
And let me say, before COVID, my committees, Committee 10, Labor, Health, Social Services, we took a review after 9/11 of our basic public health laws.
Yeah.
And we spent a lot of time with the state epidemiologist. I don't remember what her name was, but she was very good. She was the one that dealt with the Afton crisis where they had their water supply contaminated. And she was on loan from CDC. And she was doctor of veterinary medicine, which is not unusual for epidemiologists. We had one, gosh, what's his name? He goes to my church. I forget. Anyhow, on state payroll for a long time, DVM, in the epidemiological world. And we got her in and we reviewed those laws very carefully. And they were written about 1900, 1910, when the crisis that people had in mind was a smallpox epidemic. And there were enough people around who had either personally or indirectly experience with a smallpox outbreak and knew how bad it could be. And they wrote the laws accordingly. And one of the Supreme Court cases dates back to similar Massachusetts law, compulsory vaccination, that upholds the state's ability to do drastic things in a crisis. And I remembered my experience with the diphtheria outbreak in Casper.
Yeah,
I told you.
right.
And we looked over those laws and we said, these give the state health officers some scary powers. And Dr. Sherrard was the state health officer about that point. And he occasionally used those powers. It was mostly with tuberculosis, because tuberculosis used to be a really major killer.
And it still is worldwide. I mean,
It still is
absolutely.
worldwide. And I had some family experience with that. My maternal grandfather came down with it in 1916. He was a cotton broker on the New York Cotton Exchange. And they sent him up to, the prescription was fresh air and exercise.
Yeah.
Because they had no idea what caused it.
Right.
No idea really how to treat it.
Right.
And they sent him up to the first Vermont and then the Adirondacks to basically to die. And he managed to survive. He was from 1916 to about 36 or 37. He kept having life-threatening hemorrhages. And my mother said when she was growing up, there was a special nurse in the house more often than not. And fortunately, he'd done quite well on the Cotton Exchange. And I think he may have caught it at the Plattsburgh volunteer training that some of those people were doing to prepare for World War I. And he had just an awful middle age. And then he got over it and had a very healthy old age and lived to 89. But he was always a believer in exercise and staying active. So, I'd heard that story. And my dad, they got tuberculosis in the cow herd on his father's little place, and the guy that was actually running the place for it died of tuberculosis caught from the cows.
Wow.
And when he got older, in his last years, they did some scans and whatnot, because he had prostate cancer. And they discovered he had a tubercular lesion in his lungs that had not been active, but probably dated from the 1920s.
Amazing. Yeah.
It was a tremendously common disease. It's now just we have maybe 5-10 dozen cases a year in this state. But Sherrard said we got to put those people on Medicaid. So I put in a special bill and. They're all, if you got tuberculosis, you're Medicaid eligible. And it's almost all in the transient population. And he has had to quarantine. He quarantined one occasionally that was resistant to the treatment.
Right. I mean, his public health officers have almost police-like powers in different
More
states.
than that, you don't get much due process. And in dealing with a really deadly epidemic, You need that power. The COVID one was botched, partly because nobody at the first understood it,
Right.
and President Trump did not take it seriously, and that was a major problem. And the CDC proved to be absolutely incompetent in a crisis. They tried to do their own test for it, couldn't get it to work, were opposed to the private competition, and the president eventually had to override them. And the initial recommendations, as you should expect in a crisis, were not necessarily on point because we didn't yet understand what we were dealing with. You know, it was, we knew something about, because of SARS and MERS, we knew something about COVID-based diseases, but there was a lot we didn't know, and a lot we specifically didn't know about this one. And it was unusual in that it's severe enough so that you get a significant death rate with it, but not overwhelming. And I think that the early restrictions were necessary because you needed some time so the medical profession could learn how to treat the disease, because frankly, you didn't know. It was new.
Right.
You didn't know what worked and what didn't. And that caused changing recommendations and all that sort of thing. And then there was this kerfuffle. They really didn't know, did the masks do any good or not?
Right.
And they kept changing the recommendations. And a lot of places said, well, we're going to restrict everything that's not an essential job. But politically, every job is essential to the person that has it. And that's what translates into political action. So the states that tried to rely on that got themselves into a mess because they were judging where the restrictions ought to be on the basis of this, was it essential or not? And the political pressure is everything is essential. And they had a bunch of regulations that really didn't work after a while. And I think Governor Gordon and Dr. Harris, working as a team, did as good a job in the initial stages in Wyoming as could be done anywhere. And their approach was not, is it essential or not? But by and large, their approach is, okay, what do you need to do to make it safe to do what you want to do? And when you adopt that approach, then you start getting a more rational approach to the thing, and you can deal with the fact that not every things are important, but not necessarily crash essential. You don't make judgments on that. You make judgment. Okay, you need to keep the grocery store open. Special hours with restrictions for the people at highest risk, my age group. You concentrate on trying to keep the spread down so your hospitals aren't overwhelmed. They did a pretty good job of that. Now, assisted by the fact we do not have a large metropolitan area.
Yes.
You know, we have more natural social distancing in Wyoming than elsewhere. And I'm an example of that. I always, we adjourned about the day of the first case in Wyoming, and I'm responsible for part of that. We needed to have a knockdown, drag out with the House on their negotiating tactics on budget, and we had a 15 to 15 vote to kill the budget, which would have been the first step. And that would have been a special session, 2-week bloody knockdown process till they quit screwing around with us. And you got a reasonable compromise between the House and Senate. First stage, you getting the spending under control where we were having problems. And if COVID had not been there, I was part of the vote that was no. And I switched my vote because I thought, this is going to last another couple of weeks, and next week we are going to be asked to leave town because this place will spread anything. everything goes around the state and winds up down here. But we got out of town. I got home. You know, I stocked up food after being down here for a while. You know, I let all the perishables. And I carried a reserve out on the ranch because you got to watch out for blizzards and things you can't get in town. Stocked up a bit and didn't go to the grocery store or any commercial establishment in town for a whole month. And you know, on the farm, and we raised a certain amount. And I said, my social distance and my normal job is a mile. But Wyoming in general, we work outside. This didn't spread well outside, and we knew it. And people could easier take precautions. In a small town, the word gets around which families you need to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Wyoming had an easier time by not having the big impersonal setting. And the governor was being sensible. So we probably had the best time. I'll bet when we finally look at the education results, we're going to have done a lot better because we kept the schools open in person.
Yep.
Much more than any place else did.
Yep.
So we did a good job, but it was a mild enough disease and there was enough confusion. Trump did the right thing nationally by pushing the vaccines, and we were lucky because the companies had done a lot of work preparing for a SARS outbreak and doing vaccine development work, and they had this new technique that was adaptable. So we got a vaccine a lot quicker, and President Trump lit a fire under this bureaucrats in the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, to get it safe, but get it done.
Yes.
We don't have enough time to deal with cross all the I's and dot all the T's because we've got a deadly epidemic going, and we need that vaccine yesterday.
So
and that was very valuable. But you know, we lost a bunch of, and then we had a bunch of people that would not take it seriously. And we see that. I go to Dr. Burke in Casper, and we talk quite a bit. And he keeps telling tales of people that just won't take precautions, won't take the vaccine, and they wind up dead. Or they wind up with an awful disease. And until the vaccination was readily available, it was just flat dangerous. And I was told, no uncertain terms, that with my diabetes, I was at risk, and I damn well better not catch it. And so I was watching very carefully. I remembered the reaction in Casper when we had that diphtheria outbreak, and a lot of people wanted that vaccine right now. And when they first went from their priority, you know, first responders, and then they were giving teachers a priority, to opening it to people over 70, I was watching the news media very carefully for that. And Nancy was putting pressure on me. And as soon as they did that, I called up and got on the list to get it and got the vaccine in January. As soon as I was eligible.
I think that's just the right thing to do. I absolutely do.
Yeah.
So, Senator Scott, you've been super generous with your time with us today, which we very much appreciate. Let me ask you just a few more questions.
Well, let me get back to the COVID thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that scares me is we have so modified our laws because people thought that governmental restrictions in COVID were unreasonable. The next epidemic, and there will be one, I don't guarantee you when, but there will be one. If it is a good deal more deadly, we are going to regret what we have done to our laws, and we're going to kill a lot of people. We were better off with the old laws that they put together to combat smallpox. And the worst scenario I can see is if somebody finds some weaponized smallpox that the Soviet Union had, and that gets into the hands of a terrorist, we're going to have a major crisis. We have advertised our society's vulnerability to a pandemic to every terrorist in the world. Thank God most of them don't have the capacity to make use of that knowledge. But if they get their hands on it, we'll have an epidemic. or there's any number of zoonotic diseases that could evolve and surprise us.
Right.
And as Sheila knows, I wrote a book novel that I could never sell on that, and it would. The COVID experience has left us less well prepared because people will say, "Well, the lessons of COVID apply." No, they don't.
Right. It'll be
In
different next
all
time.
probability, the next one could be much more deadly, could spread through the schools, which COVID didn't much.
Right.
But that's the typical route for one of these things spreading. And we would react all wrong because of the COVID experience.
So you think the pendulum swung too far away from the smallpox rules and it
Yes.
needs to go back the other way?
Needs to go back the other way. And I found it very difficult to get people to understand what could happen that's outside their experience. So the once in a lifetime or once in a couple hundred years crisis that would be the next epidemic, we won't be prepared for because people won't. They won't prepare for something that's outside their experience.
Yeah.
They just have trouble visualizing what might happen. Now that Black Swan book is interesting on just that score.
What do you think the law should be? I mean, if you could write the law yourself, if it was just you, how would you change the law for the state health officer?
I'd go back to the 1906 law. Give her the ability to do drastic things. If you get a deadly contagious disease that you do not have treatment for, that you do not have a vaccine for, which is the description of a pandemic, you need to give that health officer fearsome powers because you're going to have to fight it with isolation and quarantine because that's all you've got.
Yep.
Eventually you'll learn, as we did with this time, like the business of a milder oxygen rather than a ventilator is more effective. And we developed techniques for treating COVID that were much more successful after we'd had a little experience. But you've got to slow it down. And you've got to be able to quarantine and enforce that quarantine. And if the laws won't permit you, you're going to kill a lot of people.
Yeah,
And that's what I'm afraid of. And trying to talk this bunch down here into that, they can't visualize that that's a possibility. They just can't and won't for ideological reasons sometimes. I have troubles with the far right on that score. But it's not limited to the far right. We could get ourselves in real trouble.
Yeah, that's great.
So that's my answer on that, and I am concerned about that. Deeply concerned about that. And then we need a major healthcare reform in this state. Obamacare is based on an incorrect diagnosis. Their diagnosis, the problem was people can't afford it because of the insurance. No. The problem is that the utilization is out of hand. And the costs are higher than what we need because of that. And that diagnosis has kept us from doing effective reforms and it'll take a lot of back and forth and whatnot. And it'll be hard because so much people's incomes is at stake.
Right.
And people have trouble realizing that there can be such thing as too much health care. And you know more better than I do what it actually is, but it's clearly there from the statistics.
And how would you get there? If you could wave a magic wand and you could change the system, how would you change it?
Healthy Frontiers is what I'd do. And large-scale use of health savings accounts with rewards for not spending the money until you need to, with the ability to bail out and catastrophic insurance on top of that thing, and get rid of a lot of the paperwork for insurance, that sort of thing. Use it for the Medicare population. You got some special problems because as we get older, we start to lose our facilities and eventually can't manage it the way a younger person could.
Right.
So we may have to, you might take the traditional Medicare and say, okay, you go on that at 75 or 80, But in the meantime, you put everybody on health savings accounts. The people that can't afford it, you subsidize it, you make it mandatory for employed people. There's a bunch of ways, and you would take a bit of adjusting and a lot of education, because people don't realize that they need to be conservative in what they do. That would be a big help. Try to get the utilization problem under control. Do something about the malpractice, because that's where the malpractice awards are a small portion. It's what you do to avoid getting in court that runs the expense up. So you got to cure that problem, and you've got a special interest group that dominates the courts that are going to fight you. So you got to do that. You need those kind of reforms, and I got eventually just frustrated chairing the health committee because Obamacare blocks most of the reforms that make sense. And until it gets so bad that there's a crisis we just can't stand. The cost, I don't know what the cost level that is. Then we'll have to have a reform, and it'll probably be a mess. And I hope we don't go socialized, because I don't like some of that. But that's where we're headed. And some of the medical society has not been helpful in that, because they got too much income at stake in the court system.
Right. Yep. Yeah, that's part of the problem, right? Is there's a lot of people who make a lot of money from the U.S. healthcare system.
Yes. Yeah, and that's one of the big obstacles. But we've barked down the wrong tree because they missed their diagnosis with Obamacare.
Let me ask you just a couple more questions.
Okay.
Let me ask you to predict the future. What does healthcare in Wyoming look like 25 years from now or 40 years from now? How's it going to be different?
We're in trouble. We are losing local control of our hospitals. Our idiot county commissioners up in Casper allowed them to sell that hospital. And that is a mistake. The risk we run with that, and with the arrangements here in Cheyenne, is that a rational administration of the healthcare says, concentrate it where you can get the volume. Because of the high fixed cost, you need the volume to offset that.
Right.
And that's people don't appreciate, they think there is a cost for things. There is not. There are multiple costs, and they have components. And high fixed cost means you need volume to offset it. And that would drive a lot of our healthcare over the border into Colorado, Montana, Rapid City, Salt Lake City. And we will then lose the specialists that can provide emergency care. They can't make a living off that. It's a portion of their practice. They'll have to go where they can make a living, and we will not have that available. And that's going to hurt, or that's going to cost us lives, because there's times you can't get to the specialist.
Right.
There's times you don't have enough time to get there. There's times with our weather you can't get there.
Absolutely.
And there's times it just takes too long. And it'll become more risky to live in Wyoming because of that. And we're going to have to fight to get enough primary care. And my personal opinion is that a person's primary care doctor is the key. You get a good primary care doctor, they can do a lot that prevents more trouble. Dr. Burke tells me to take a particular pill. I will question him as to what it does and what I got to watch out for and that sort of thing. But I will damn near try to take it exactly as he prescribes, and depend on him to spot when it's starting to go bad. And eventually some of them do. I was on metformin for years and then got side effects.
Sure.
Had to change. Okay. I told him we had to change. The side effect was getting unacceptable. But I was on a generic diuretic, and it was starting, showed up in the lab test doing some kidney damage. Okay, he said we got to change. And it took a while to get that straightened out. But that's why you go back to the doctor for the checkup. primary care is of key importance. And Governor Friedenthal tells a story that I've heard him tell in public, so I don't mind repeating it. You may have heard it.
Go ahead.
Well, he said he had a problem with chewing tobacco. He liked to chew tobacco. And as we talked, tobacco is the worst thing you can do to yourself. Chewing isn't quite as bad as smoking.
Right. But it's not great.
It's bad. And he said he went to see his doctor. And the doctor said to him, Dave, have you been able to stop chewing? He said, well, no, doctor, I really haven't. Okay. And the doctor said to him, Dave, you going to stop or am I going to have to call Nancy? And Dave said, whatever, what is about patient confidentiality and all that sort of thing. And the doctor said to him, so who's going to sue? Dave, are you going to stop chewing or am I going to have to call Nancy? And he said between his doctor and his wife and his daughter, they bullied him out of it. But that's a story of only a doctor that really knows his patient
Right.
could say that.
Right, had that relationship. Yep.
Otherwise, he would get sued sooner or later.
Right.
So the primary care doctor is absolutely the key. And maybe a good physician's assistant or nurse practitioner could do that. Because a lot of that stuff is not rocket science. You gotta have the medical knowledge. But more of it is the touch with the individual patient to get compliance and to get them on the right stuff to start with. And getting those people is going to be a struggle for our future, especially if a lot of the specialists flee elsewhere.
Yeah, right.
And
So how do you get people to go into primary care? I mean, I can tell you, I work with medical students, and there are a lot of incentives to become a specialist for medical students. They make more money, and frankly, the job is easier oftentimes. And think about your dad's experience of being on call 24/7, 365. A lot of students don't want that life. They'd be happy to be a specialist, make twice as much money, and work far fewer hours.
Yeah. And my dad enjoyed the practice of pediatrics. And he did it for 25 years, thoroughly enjoyed it. And then he was ranching too much. And he said he just couldn't keep up the way he should anymore, and it was time to retire. Burned out. But you have that desire. We've all gotten soft, and life has gotten easier. And there's ways you work around that. Yeah, if you have enough. You aren't on call 24 hours anymore. But getting enough primary care is a problem. The first thing that needs to be done is national. The damn federal government, the CMS, which is an evil organization, just plain evil. What they did was they set medical rates with a panel. And their panels were dominated by specialists, because obviously they're better than grubby primary care, right? So how did the rates get? The things the specialists do get paid a lot better.
Right.
So, and that got out of hand. Now, it makes sense to have some extra for specialists. You need them. They do real crisis things. That, if you need one, you need them bad. But we have unbalanced it, and we need to rebalance it and pay the primary care doctors a lot better and the specialists less.
Amen. I couldn't agree more.
And that is a war. And they're not willing to, and the federal government is too stupid to realize that they have biased the results by the way they set their rates. And that's a major problem for the society as a whole. And that's been a problem. Witness my early experience with dealing with the medical school dean that was the assistant secretary of health. It's an ongoing problem, and we need to deal with that. And specialists may not like what I'm saying. But
no, I think you're right on. I mean, there's no question.
Yeah, that's a reform we desperately need, and the private insurance has copied the federal government. That's become the standard. We need to reverse that. We desperately. That's how the rest of the world is doing better than we are. They have not done that.
Right.
Specialists make a little more, but not a lot more. and they produce a lot more primary care.
Yep.
They need to educate some of them better, but they've got it right and we've got it wrong.
All right, let me ask you one more question.
Now,
So-
were you the primary care or your specialist?
I'm not going to tell. let me ask you one more. Let's say 30, 40 years from now, there's a new legislator comes to Wyoming, and they plan to have a long career in the legislature. They want to break your record. They want to be legislator for 50 years, and they're young. They're 25 years old. They just got elected.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them? How do you be a good legislator?
You've got to, first you got to do your own thinking. And you've got to, whatever, legislature, we all specialize. You've got to really understand the area you're into. I've just gotten myself into education after being away from it for years. And I've spent a lot of time trying to learn the fundamentals of what's going on there. And you've got to understand that. So that's the first thing. Do your own, you learning anywhere you can learn about anything. It's relevant down here to something. And the more you can just generally improve your education. What I'm doing is, have you seen these great course things that are advertised?
I sure have. My dad does those. Yep.
When I'm eating at home alone, because I live alone, I watch one of those things every evening over supper, and I'm learning all kinds of interesting stuff. And part of this, I think, part of the key to a successful old age is keep on learning. But that helps me down here. I know a lot more about almost anything they're talking about, and that's helpful. And then you've got to realize that legislation, good legislation, is compromise. The art of compromise is the art of good legislation. And there's people down here that know a lot about something. They have something to say, you got to pay attention. And working with that, and you know, we're a democratic society, and everybody's got interests, and you want to do what you think needs to be done with the least collateral damage to everybody else that you can. And I hope they keep this a citizens legislature that is part-time. We're getting away from that rapidly, and it's going to be trouble. We're losing. Used to be we'd get the most successful men and women in the state. We aren't getting them anymore. And the reason is it's too time consuming. We've got to abolish a bunch of special committees. We've got to rein in some of the things we're doing and get legislators off this, that, and the other special thing. And stick to business and try to keep it such that it's very much a part-time job. Because we have an advantage as a citizens legislature. We get, if a full-time professional legislature and you get a special interest that wants something and threatens to run against you, will get you in the next election. A full-time professional's got to worry about that, because they lose their job, they've lost their career, and they've got to start a different career, and that is painful to people.
Sure.
One of us gets threatened that way. We can tell the lobbyist and special interest where to get off, and the worst thing they can do is beat us to the next election. We'll stay home, tend to business, and make more money. And that gives a citizens legislature a big advantage. We can say no. People that need to have no said to them. We don't do it as much as we should, but we can do it and do when it's important.
That is great.
So, and then you got to pay attention to the people you represent. And for me, that's meant big door-to-door campaigns. I spend a lot of time just knocking on doors and talking to people. And my technique is I get a yellow pad and a question that's relevant to something the legislature is doing, and ask people one question a door. Say, I introduce myself, give them a brochure so they know who they're talking to, and say, okay, there's a proposal to raise the gasoline tax by 14 cents to get better streets and highways. Are you for that or opposed to it? I get an answer.
Yeah.
And in the process, I learn a lot about, because they'll tell me why, often. I learn a lot about the people I'm representing, and people like it. You have to have some technique that keeps you current and available.
Yeah.
And it does mean being pretty gregarious. I go to town to get a part or go grocery shopping. It takes me longer than most people because I talk to people. I talk to them. You got to have that kind of an attitude to be successful.
Do people ever come back and say, hey, when you came to my door that day, I told you I was against that tax and you voted for it. Now I'm mad at you.
I've not had that experience. And I've picked up a lot of stuff that I needed to know. Was asking Medicaid expansion and found out the public was opposed to it. And got a lot of tales about things wrong with Medicaid. Okay, it's safe to be opposed to it. That's useful to know. Asked about cell phone usage, and 80% of the population thinks that it's not safe to use a cell phone while driving. We ought to ban it. And I heard some awful horror stories. I remember the woman that told me she lost her sister-in-law, who was on a cell phone and distracted her, and she drove into the front of a semi at 60. And a lot of others told me about this, that, and the other close call they had with people who were on cell phones and not paying attention. So I'm enthusiastic on money. I haven't tried to do it myself, but when Esquibel was here, he was trying that sort of thing, and I supported him. That's a problem we haven't solved. But you need to be in touch with your constituency.
No, that's great.
And don't think you're something high and mighty because you're down here, because you offend people.
That's great. That is just great.
Okay, I don't know whether we've covered the things you really wanted to get covered, or
No, you did. You absolutely did. Thank you.
Yeah, Senator Scott, this has been a tremendous privilege, and you've been so generous with your time. I mean, thank you so much.
I enjoy, just talking about, I'm in the process of writing a book on the legislature. And what I want to do is do it mostly in a light format, anecdotes. Title will be Russ Zimmer's Truck and Other Tales of Wyoming's People in Their Legislature.
Wow.
And mostly, I want to avoid the dry, pedantic stuff. I'll have a little bit. I want to take a bill all the way through the process, so I'm doing that with the Hathaway, and I found some things to add to it this time. But that was my bill, and how that improved on its way through. So that's a little dry, but it's mostly going to kind of have mostly stories. And
That's great.
humorous things, but try to convey what it's really like down here.
Well, you should think about doing another video too. I think videos add so much, and it's great to hear from people directly when they tell these stories. Maybe when you're done with your book, we'll have you come back and we'll do another video.
Yeah. Well, I hope this is the sort of thing you were looking for.
I think it's tremendous. I think it's great.
And I wanted to give you some of the stuff I'd learned growing up.
You bet. You bet. Well, that's such great perspective because, people want to hear that history, and that history is so important, and it really explains a lot of how you approach things now, right?
Yeah. Everything is grist for the mill, and I learned a bunch of things and learned how to analyze things.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, connected the dots from smallpox to diphtheria to 9/11 to COVID to what's going to happen 20 years from now, right?
And we didn't cover a bunch of the anti-vax things that I think are a major problem. And you look at the history of vaccines, you know why they got there, because there was a lot of trouble with the smallpox vaccine because they did not understand what they were doing and had contamination problems, and they just hadn't developed the germ theory yet. And they knew it worked, but they didn't understand it well enough to avoid some catastrophes. And that's some of the origin of the anti-vax thing. But it was expressed very early on as that Punch cartoon about 10 years after the vaccine was discovered in 1805 or something, with little cows.
Right,
coming-
Jenner and cowpox. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But the cartoon was anti-vax and showed little cows growing out of people's arms and everything. Classic example of the anti-vax, very early on. So it dates way back. It's a primitive instinct, and it's dead wrong
Yep. That's right.
and fatal.
Absolutely.
But a lot of people have it, and I hear the most crazy things downstairs from some of our members. Homeopathy. Just things that I know are medically just flat wrong.
But they truly believe them.
They truly believe it,
Yeah.
and it's going to kill people.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I probably kept you a lot longer than
No, no, it's perfect.
Great.
It's great. Yeah, we live.
God, look at the time.
No, Senator, you have so much history. It's awesome. I mean, it's tremendous.
Okay.